So here's the short list of representative geniuses for the lecture today. We'll hear mostly about Rubens this time, who was certainly one of the most cosmopolitan artists in European history, spending many years in Italy, as well as considerable time in Spain, England, and France, both as artist and diplomat. Few painters have achieved the international artistic, political, and personal success that came to him. Rembrandt, Rubens' younger contemporary, is now regarded as an even greater painter, some would say the greatest ever. Today we'll hear only about the beginning of his career, and next time he'll be our main subject. So this is where the parents of Peter Paul Rubens lived, in Antwerp. His father was a prosperous attorney, but he became a Protestant, and when the Duke of Alva arrived to try to enforce the will of Philip II of Spain, who wanted the Spanish Netherlands to remain Catholic and Spanish at all costs, Jan and Maria Rubens, Peter Paul's parents, moved to Siegen in Westphalia in Germany, where his father, Jan, became the legal and financial advisor to the estranged wife of William the Silent himself. And he became more than that. He became her lover. And when William the Silent found out about that, for just a while I think he became William the Noisy, and Jan Rubens was thrown in jail and wasn't let go for 10 years. His wife Maria remained loyal to him, however, and after his release they became the parents of Peter Paul, born in 1577. This is the earliest surviving self-portrait by Rubens, done when he was in Italy at the beginning of his career. His father died when he was 10, and his mother immediately moved back to Antwerp, which seems to indicate that her conversion to Protestantism was superficial and undertaken only to please her husband, and Rubens was raised in the Catholic faith. He became a page to a countess and presumably began acquiring the good manners and worldly savoir-faire for which he was always to be known. After less than a year as a page, however, he was allowed by his mother to become an apprentice in the studio of a minor artist who was a family relative, and in 1600, at the age of 23, he left for Italy, still regarded as the best place to see the best art. He had been admitted to the Painters' Guild in Antwerp, but he was no child or even teenage prodigy, and very little that he did before his trip to Italy survives. Like Dürer and many other northern artists before him, Rubens headed first for Venice, where he must have been much impressed by the work of Titian, who is always counted among the major influences on him. And in Venice, a piece of very good luck happened to him. Vincenzo I Gonzaga, the Duke of Mantua, was visiting the city, and one of the members of his staff met Rubens and was impressed by some work he had with him. He was introduced to the Duke, who was likewise impressed, and when he returned to Mantua, he took Rubens along. And Rubens painted this picture for him, which is still in the ducal palace there. On the lower left are Vincenzo and his father Guglielmo, and on the right are their wives. Vincenzo I was the great-grandson of Isabella d'Este Gonzaga, whom some of you may remember from the Italian Renaissance class. The subject is the Adoration of the Trinity, depicted as though painted on a kind of tapestry above the people below. And the picture has had the center section of it cut out so it would fit in a smaller space where it was wanted that it should go. Here's Vincenzo I in front of his father up closer now. Mantua gets far less attention from tourists than many other Italian cities, but from the late 15th century to the early 17th, it was as important in the arts as almost any other city on the peninsula. And in Vincenzo I's day, Rubens, Torquato Tasso, the greatest Italian poet of the day, and Monteverdi, who wrote the madrigal you're hearing now, arguably the greatest Italian composer of the day, were all connected to the Gonzaga court here. Here you can see the Ducal Palace in Mantua as it looks today, and Rubens was to spend about 10 years here on and off, although he also spent a lot of time traveling. Unfortunately, partly because of his family's lavish support of the arts, Vincenzo I's son, Vincenzo II, eventually went bankrupt and had to sell virtually all the portable parts of his art collection, much of it to Charles I of England, who in turn went bankrupt and sold a large part of it to Louis XIII. The famous frescoes by Mantegna couldn't be sold, however, and are still on the walls and ceiling of the Camera degli Sposi here. Mantegna's trompe-l'oeil ceiling for the Camera, painted about 1465, was the first of its kind and must have impressed Rubens, who was to do a lot of this sort of dramatic perspective painting himself. The Palazzo del Te, another Gonzaga palace in Mantua, also has theatrical paintings by Raphael's pupil Giulio Romano, which are still there and from which Rubens borrowed ideas. Although he was raised and trained in Flanders and didn't visit Italy until he was, as I said, in his 20s, his style of painting was to have far more in common with that of his Italian predecessors than with his Flemish ones. Rubens did travel all over Italy, partly to see things that interested him, and partly on commission from Vincenzo to copy works whose owners wouldn't sell them, or paint other subjects that Vincenzo wanted. He painted this picture of the Marchesa Brigida Spinola Doria in Genoa for what Vincenzo called his Gallery of Beauties. As I suggested, Rubens is not known for displaying the traditional Flemish interest in detail, and while not a picture which one would mistake for the work of Van Eyck, this is one of his more finely focused portraits. It's important to notice the smile, because even though Mona Lisa was painted all the way back in 1503, smiling or otherwise expressive portrait subjects were not yet all that common. It's in the 17th century that artists like Rubens himself and Hals and of course Rembrandt do them a lot. In Rome, he made this drawing of the famous Laocoon, one of the greatest works of Hellenistic sculpture to survive, and a work that has much in common with a lot of the pictures full of writhing bodies which he would later paint. The Hellenistic style is in fact often described using the same adjectives that are applied to Baroque art: dramatic, theatrical, muscular, masculine, energetic, emotional, and so on. In Florence, he made this copy of Leonardo's cartoon for the Battle of Anghiari, which was never painted. After seeing all the typically serene and tranquil Renaissance art in Florence, when he came across this, he must have said to himself, "Now this is more like it." And this is certainly one of the most dramatically proto-Baroque works of art by anyone in the whole of the Italian Renaissance. This is Raphael's St. George and the Dragon, painted almost exactly a century before Rubens' version of the same subject, which we'll see in just a minute, and which makes an effective contrast with it. The goal of Renaissance art was typically, as I suggested, to make the representation as serene and tranquil as possible, consistent with the nature of the subject. Since this is a picture of a man fighting a dragon, there obviously has to be some action, a little drama, but Raphael puts in the minimum possible. This is as serene a dragon fight as one could paint. The lack of weather in virtually all Renaissance pictures adds to the tranquility of them. Here there's a cloudless, serene sky, no wind to make even a leaf on the tranquil trees move. If you're on the other side of that rock, you have no idea a man is killing a dragon on this side. And now we'll see Rubens' Baroque interpretation of the subject. This is Rubens' version now, and here we have an absolute maelstrom of the most violent action, theatrically lit under a dark sky, and no human body like that of St. George had ever before been seen in Flemish art. If you keep these two pictures in mind, you'll have a good idea of one of the basic differences between the character of the Renaissance and that of the Baroque. This painting was begun in Italy, but in 1608 Rubens returned to Antwerp because of the illness of his mother, who in fact died before he arrived, and he may have brought this with him and finished it there, where it must have stunned everyone who saw it if he did. In a way, the horse is really the star of the painting, and Rubens, more than any artist before him, recognized how animals could add to the drama of a picture. Renaissance artists rarely idealized animals in this way. This is no ordinary horse, any more than St. George is an ordinary man. He's a superman, and this is a super horse. This is a portrait of Philip II's daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, by Rubens' friend and contemporary Franz Pourbus the Younger. When Philip II died in 1598, he had, in one of his wiser moments, turned over the government of the Spanish Netherlands to her and her husband, Archduke Albert, who was also her second cousin and brother of the Emperor Rudolf. And at the time of Rubens' return, the details of a 12-year truce with the Dutch were being finalized. This truce would make the Spanish Netherlands, what we think of as Belgium today, a much more pleasant place to live than it had been during the reign of Philip II. It's obvious from this picture why Pourbus was a popular painter, but nevertheless the subject looks to modern critics a little too much like a kind of plastic Cupid doll for it to be considered a great work of art. This is a portrait of Isabella Clara Eugenia by Rubens now, and while this is not maybe one of his greatest portraits, the subject certainly looks more alive than in the picture by Pourbus. No one would mistake this for a picture of a department store mannequin. One might suppose that since her husband was the brother of the emperor, he would have been the real ruler of the Netherlands. But Albert was not a strong personality and seems to have been content to let Isabella make most of the decisions. And it was likely Isabella who, impressed by Rubens as an artist and as a man, made him offers he couldn't refuse to stay in Antwerp. He was likely also influenced by the fact that his brother Philip, to whom he was very close, was also there, and the fact that there was a lot of work for a good painter, replacing works which had been destroyed during the fighting with the Protestants and the Dutch. In any case, Rubens broke his contract with the Gonzagas and never returned to Mantua. This is another portrait by Pourbus, this time of the Archduke Albert now, and I think this picture is really one of the more memorable of the day. It may look just a bit artificial, a bit plasticized in the manner of his portrait of Isabella Clara Eugenia, but I've seen people walk by this and do a real double take. It really does look not so much like a photograph, but like someone actually looking through the wall at you from the other side. The terms of the deal by which Philip II turned the Netherlands over to Isabella Clara Eugenia stipulated that if she were to die with no children, control would revert to Spain at her death, and unfortunately she will have had no children by Albert. As I said, the fact that Rubens' brother Philip was in Antwerp likely influenced him to stay, and Philip's wife's niece, Isabella Brandt, may also have been an influence because Rubens married her in 1609, less than a year after his return, when she was 18 and he was 32, and this is the picture he painted to commemorate the event. Rubens is going to become famous, of course, for painting a lot of big, fluffy women, but it's worth noticing that he didn't marry one of those. He and his wife both looked the part of the elegant de facto aristocrats they were. Isabella Brandt was the daughter of a highly regarded scholar, lawyer, and government official, Jan Brandt, and Rubens himself, of course, was well-traveled, a man of the world on a first-name basis with the Archduchess herself by this time. Like Albrecht Dürer, he depicts himself as the consummate gentleman, not as any sort of manual laborer, that's for sure. Despite the fabulous outfits, there's a kind of romantic informality about the picture that makes many think of Gainsborough's portraits of English aristocrats 150 years later. Here he is up closer. Considering how handsome, rich, talented, well-respected, and well-connected he was or was to become, it's a bit surprising to find that he was apparently a loyal family man without one single scandalous anecdote against him. And Isabella seems to have been a very good wife. All goodness and all sincerity, he says, and free of what he calls the usual vices of women, though he doesn't say what those are. Here's another picture of her by her husband with a lot of Baroque expression in it. They were to have 2 children, but she was to die young in 1626 while just in her 30s. This is Antwerp as it looks today now, with the cathedral, the largest Gothic church in Belgium, with a 470-foot spire in the center. At the far left is the town hall on the main square, and the house where Rubens' most famous pupil, Anthony van Dyck, was born, stands just beyond it at the upper left-hand corner of the square. Much of Antwerp, including the cathedral, was made a mess of by the Calvinists in 1566, and then by the Spanish 10 years later, and then again by the Spanish in 1585. So, as I mentioned, there was a lot of work for an artist of Rubens' stature, and his studio, some would say his factory, was to run day and night for the next 30 years here, turning out hundreds of pictures. Surprisingly, however, few important things were done by him directly on commission from the Archduke and Duchess. Like Lorenzo de' Medici in Renaissance Florence or Philip the Good in Renaissance Flanders, they presided over an art-friendly environment, but did not commission any great masterpieces themselves. Rubens' first great works, some would say the greatest things he ever did, are now on display in the cathedral. And you see here the altarpiece known as the Raising of the Cross, made for the Church of St. Walburga, which no longer exists. This is very large, almost on the scale of an Italian fresco with life-size figures. It's hard to believe that Rubens' immediate predecessor in the history of great Flemish art was Peter Bruegel. Where are the fat little peasants in fur hats bundled up against the cold and snow, the drunken street people dancing in the mud? Bruegel, and pretty much the whole tradition of Flemish art, certainly had little influence on Rubens. These people look like they've come right down off the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's hard to sort out what might have been the influences on any great artist, of course, but although he felt no affinity for the serenity of 15th century Italian art, his heroic and dramatically positioned and lit figures seem clearly to owe a lot to the Italians from Michelangelo to Caravaggio. Here's the center of the altarpiece up closer. Like Michelangelo, he was an artistic Platonist. He gives Christ a body consistent with the heroic character of his soul. Notice that this is not, of course, the stable Christ on the cross of the Renaissance, but the raising of the cross, which is thoroughly Baroque in the violent energy that Rubens puts into it. The episode does not come across as sad or mournful, but as triumphantly heroic. Christ himself seems to strain to help get the cross erect, and his tormentors come across more like allies, more like fellow heroes than enemies. The atmosphere here is like that of the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. It's full of Catholic optimism, the view that this sacrifice made eternal life and happiness possible for us all. Next week we'll see Rembrandt's version of the same subject painted from the Protestant perspective, which produces a different kind of picture altogether. We're going to see the other great altarpiece which Rubens painted for the Cathedral of Antwerp itself at this time. Its subject is the descent from the cross, or the deposition, and we'll hear part of the famous Musicalis Exequian, the funeral music, by the greatest composer of Rubens' day, Heinrich Schütz. This is a closer view of the whole altarpiece. This is the left-hand panel. The Visitation is the subject. And on the right side, the presentation in the temple. And here's the deposition itself now, with Christ as the fallen hero taken from the battlefield. And this is Rubens' Resurrection, also in the cathedral. For a Jesuit church in Neuburg, about the same time that he was working on these pictures, he painted the Fall of the Damned in 1616, but I don't really think his heart was in this. I think he was basically just too upbeat and positive an outlook to do a very good job on this kind of subject. Here's a closer look at it. Like Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, it could be called both monotonous and monochromatic. It is of some comfort to me, though, to see how few skinny people seem to be going to hell here. If any of these people were among the rebel angels, it's hard to see how they could have flown very far. But even if Rubens might not have been at his best painting hell, he was very versatile. He could be working on the Assumption of the Virgin on one side of his studio and a picture like this one here. The battle between the Greeks and the Amazons on the other side at the same time. He did no sculpture or architecture, but within his chosen medium, he could do just about anything wanted in the way of subject matter. I do think, though, that this is the kind of thing at which he was really the best. Wild action full of heroes and horses, weather and women all mixed together in a stormy package of Baroque vitality. This was painted for the Antwerp connoisseur Cornelis van der Geest, who arranged the commission for the raising of the cross. For Maximilian I, the Duke of Bavaria, he painted a series of hunting pictures that are now in the Munich Alt Pinakothek, which has the largest collection of Rubens paintings anywhere today, about 80. Picasso once boasted, "Give me a museum and I'll fill it up," and Rubens could certainly have made the same claim. This is the Great Lion Hunt, and now the Great Hippopotamus Hunt. It's man and dog versus hippo and crocodile. Also in Munich is the result of the Great Boar Hunt. Meleager has killed the so-called Caledonian boar, the head of which he is presenting to his beloved Atalanta, who looks like she's saying something like, "Oh, for me, you shouldn't have." But I think she might have preferred a box of chocolates, in fact. And then there's the Great Girl Hunt again in Munich. Here, Castor and Pollux are shown abducting, or attempting to abduct, the daughters of Leucippus, but they're going to need some help getting these girls on their horses, I think. Rubens is, of course, famous for painting giant nude women like this, so different from what we think a beautiful woman should look like today. But is this just a reflection of a difference in taste or something else? Kenneth Clark, in his scholarly treatment of the nude in the history of art, says he thinks that Rubens painted women this way so that he would not be accused of making them erotic. Sir Kenneth says that for a body to be erotic, it has to be manageable, and it's certainly true that these are about the most unmanageable bodies possible. It's an interesting theory, but it doesn't altogether convince me. He could have just left their clothes on if he didn't want to be accused of superficial eroticism. Apropos of what was thought beautiful, too, I think the one thing most praised about women in the 17th century is probably fair skin, and the more of it the better, perhaps. Here's a self-portrait by Rubens, which has something in the expression that has always made me suspect it of being a forgery, although no one else thinks it is. It was, in fact, on the cover of the catalog for the big exhibit in Antwerp in 1977, honoring the 400th anniversary of his birth. Rubens painted about 10 self-portraits, more than any other major painter before Rembrandt, and unlike Rembrandt, he always looks real good. This was probably painted about 1615 or so, at about the time, anyway, between 1610 and 1620, when he was painting most of the pictures we've seen by him so far, and he had enough money even early in this period to buy a fine house in Antwerp and then build a big studio next to it. Here's the house now as it looks today. It's the Flemish-style mansion at the left with the stepped gables, and the studio Rubens built is next to it on the right in a very different, very Italianate style. Here's the garden side of the complex with the studio at the left now, and this facade is even more Italianate with classical friezes, statues in niches, pedimented windows, rusticated columns, balustrades, and so on. All this kind of thing obviously made a big impression on Rubens during the time he spent on the other side of the Alps. Here's the right side of the studio building from the perspective of the last picture, and at the right you can see the Italian-style open loggia which connects the studio to the house. The studio building essentially consisted of two big rooms, the main studio which occupied the lower two floors, and a smaller studio which was used by students on the top floor. Here's the main studio inside now. By all accounts, Rubens and his assistants put on quite a show here, and the raised walkway at the back was used to allow visitors to observe the work while not getting underfoot. I think he could have sold tickets. One tourist describes Rubens painting while having Livy's History of Rome read to him in Latin as he dictated letters in various languages to a secretary. Eventually he would be fluent in at least 6 languages. We're going to see some more of Rubens' house now, and hear a piece of music by the English-born composer John Bull, who played the organ in the Cathedral of Antwerp from 1617 to 1628, and who was a personal friend of Rubens. This piece is played on a virginal, which, like the spinet, was a smaller version of a harpsichord. Here you're looking across that open loggia from the studio to the house. This room was once called the large bedroom, and it was probably in this room that Rubens died. This is the kitchen. Another view of the kitchen. This is one of the small bedrooms. This called the family room. The dining room, and it is part of the house which has probably changed least since Rubens' day. It even has the original leather wallpaper or wall covering. Rubens was himself a great collector of the works of other artists and is said to have owned 10 Titians and 12 Bruegels. In this picture, you can see the room which was called the gallery in his house, and adjoining it is another which was used for the display of his collection of classical statuary. None of the things on display now are thought to have been owned by him, but the picture on the back wall at the right is an interesting one. It depicts the collection of Rubens' friend, Cornelis van der Geest, who, as I mentioned earlier, arranged the commission for the raising of the cross, and for whom Rubens painted the battle with the Amazons, which hangs on the back wall at the lower left in the painting. Here's part of that picture now, which was painted by Willem van Hecht, who lived in van der Geest's own mansion for many years as a sort of artist in residence. At the left is Isabella Clara Eugenia, who, despite her reputation for good humor, almost always looks upset about something. And next to her is the Archduke Albert, and they are being given a lesson in connoisseurship by none other than Rubens himself.
The fellow at the right, pointing at the picture, is apparently van der Geest.
In any case, the picture they're discussing is a Madonna and Child by Quentin Matsys. Well, here's the lady of the house now. This is a sketch which Rubens made of his wife, Isabella. Remember, she was to die at 35 during an outbreak of the plague, and I think she looks 35 already in this picture. We have another opportunity with this to compare a sketch with a finished picture apparently based on it. And here's the finished picture, which is in the Uffizi Gallery today. Last quarter I suggested that when we can make this kind of comparison, it often seems as though there is more life in the sketch than in the finished painting, and here I think one could argue that the first treatment also in the sketch is the more vivacious of the two. This is the picture in the Pitti Palace in Florence, known as The Four Philosophers by Rubens. The painter himself appears at the left with his brother Philip in front of him, and at the right are the scholar Justus Lipsius with the fur on, and Jan Voverius, another scholar. The picture was probably painted primarily to honor Philip, who had died shortly before it was painted. Philip was a highly respected classical scholar and had been a pupil of Lipsius at the University of Louvain. Above on the right is probably a bust of Seneca commemorating Lipsius's edition of his work. Barely visible at the lower right is Voverius's dog Mopsus. Voverius's most famous work was a treatise on the good qualities of dogs. Here are Lipsius and Voverius up closer. Lipsius was also famous for having memorized the whole surviving corpus of Tacitus, and he made a little money on the side betting people he could quote any passage desired with a knife at his throat. Sort of the 17th century version of publish or perish, I guess. In addition to teaching at the Catholic University of Louvain, he had also taught at the Protestant University of Leiden, which Rembrandt would later attend, as we'll see. In the background is depicted the western end of the Capitoline Hill in Rome, an obvious reference to the classical interests of the portrait subjects. Here are Rubens and his brother Philip up closer. Philip was in fact 10 years older, but looks younger here. Rubens had himself no formal education, but acquired a thorough background in classical civilization on his own, and was never uncomfortable, even among the most accomplished academics of his day. In addition to Rubens' own house, there's another splendid 17th century residence surviving in Antwerp, the courtyard of which you see here. This place was the home, publishing house, and bookstore of Rubens' good friend, Balthazar Moretus. Moretus had married into the family of another publisher, Christophe Plantin, and with his acquisition of that business, he had something like a monopoly on book printing in the city, if not in all Flanders. By the fiat of Isabella Clara Eugenia, he was the only licensed printer of missals in the Spanish Netherlands, which guaranteed him quite an income from that source alone. The Plantin-Moretus press was still in business until about 1900, and some of the old equipment is still used here to print souvenir texts, the sale of which helps support the museum into which the place has been turned. This is a picture of part of the interior of the residence. I mentioned earlier that Isabella Clara Eugenia arranged a truce with the Dutch for 12 years, and that was to expire in 1621. In that same year, her husband Albert died, and since they had had no children, control of the Spanish Netherlands was to revert to Spain at her death, according to the will of her father Philip II of Spain. Meanwhile, in Spain, her brother Philip III, who hadn't cared much about what happened any place farther away than his own kitchen, also died that year, to be succeeded by his son Philip IV, who was to take new interest in the Netherlands he was sure to inherit. Soon, he thought, Isabella Clara Eugenia was approaching 60. Diplomats were constantly coming and going from Antwerp to Holland and Spain, as well as to and from England and France. And in the midst of all this, Rubens got the biggest oil painting commission ever given anyone from the Queen of France herself, Marie de Medici. And we'll hear how all this turned out after the break.